We are living in an American culture that has shifted from tolerant to cancel culture, from supportive to disruptive, from decent to rude, from optimistic to cynical, and from relatively safe to increasingly violent. Many are willing to exchange their liberty for a form of socialism. Through this podcast, we will chart a course to get America back on track.
Hi, I am Barry Farah, daughter of Barry Farah. My dad's a best-selling author, CEO across 6 industries, and former candidate for governor of Colorado. He is also a private pilot, adventurer, and engaging life coach. I should know. Through Culture Shift, my dad will systematically deliver a fresh and compelling path that will help you create your own American dream.
Abdication results in tyranny. Hey, welcome back to the Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. We're all about your success, and your success depends on your freedom. Today, I'd like to look at, for just a few minutes, on the alleged election fraud of 2020 in light of the convening of Congress this Wednesday, January 6th. There have been broad allegations of election problems. How should the U.S. government handle these and this type of a controversy? Well, let's first look to the founding documents when they discuss the 3 branches of government. Now, the Federalist Papers informed our founding as a nation, and 233 years ago, these Federalist Papers were written on the checks and balances. These were written by James Madison, Federalist 47 and 48. And I'm going to insert this tripod concept to discuss it because it's the idea of 3 things that can have equal tension and balance in causing at the intersection something successful, like holding a camera or what have you. So James Madison states in Federalist 47, which was January 30th, 1778, and I'm going to paraphrase from him. He basically said this, look, I want to discuss the way the power is distributed across the 3 branches. Some of the folks opposing the Constitution believe that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be separate and distinct but not have any interconnection, kind of like silos. Well, Madison said, no, we've got to have more finesse. That'd be a mistake. So he argued that we've got to think about the overall essential precaution in favor of liberty. In order to function effectively, the 3 branches of our government must have proper interdependence. Distinct powers, yes, but also the ability to keep each other in check and enough intersection points to keep them effective. We don't want to allow the accumulation of all the powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether it's of one, of a few, or of many. So, for example, executive power cannot of himself make a law, though he can put a negative on every law, nor administer justice in person, though he has the appointment of those who do administer it. So as for the judiciary, they've got balances too. The judges can exercise no executive prerogative, though they're shoots from the executive stock, nor any legislative function, though they may be advised with by legislative councils. So the entire legislature, likewise, can perform no judiciary act, though by the joint act of 2 of its branches, the judges may be removed from their offices, and though one of its branches is possessed of the judicial power in the last resort. So when, for example, the legislative and executive powers are not united in the same person or body politic, even in disagreement, there can be liberty because they have enough tension and intertwinement and separation and distinction that they keep you away from 2 of them joining with too much power. And when that happens, that could very easily become effectively one with too much power. And when that's the case, you basically got dictatorship effectively, which leads to a form of tyranny. And what happens if the legislative department tries to usurp the executive power? The executive can go to the court, and the court can rule that the legislative department's out of line. The same thing's true if the executive branch crosses the line to ignore the legislative. The legislative should be able to appeal to a wise and untarnished court to gain relief. The challenge is to say enough in the Constitution to keep the tripod of power in balance without saying too much to inadvertently expand one of the 3 branches at the expense of the other 2. Whoa, I knocked down the whole government. For example, the executive can veto legislation, but the veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote. Even after that, the judiciary can rule that the law is not consistent with the Constitution and strike it down. So the trick is to make sure the structure is elegant, like a chess move that creates an offensive and defensive move at the same time. Since we're currently in a precarious tipping of the balance of power in our country, and maybe even the abdication of power and role, within the branches of government, this framework is critical for reviewing the alleged election fraud before us and the response of the courts in particular. So here we are in January of 2021, 233 years to the month after these papers were written in defense of the U.S. Constitution. Though we've had fits and starts, the structure of the U.S. Constitution has kept our great democratic republic intact. So let's look at our current situation. It was just 12 months ago, January 2020. Seems like forever, doesn't it? The nation was flying high economically and overall doing pretty well. There wasn't any real social unrest and things were pretty good. Then in March, a virus that originated in the Wuhan province of China became a worldwide concern. And this was primarily due to the publication of the Imperial College Report, and right after that, the World Health Organization declaring it a pandemic. So the federal government shut down the country, and it determined the actions and the decisions of businesses, decided which ones were essential and not. And it had unprecedented control. It rushed through astonishing levels of government spending. Government was already monstrous and way larger than any of the founders would have possibly contemplated. And here, it ballooned once again. By summer, race relations protests had been co-opted by Marxist organizations. Those turned violent, and they destroyed billions of dollars of property. Whoever finances these groups, they've got a lot of power to organize and destroy people's businesses. So these riots erected a level of fear. If they don't get their way, they could come to your house or your business and disrupt your life as well. So leading up to the election, there were massive crowds showing up for the current POTUS. Some of them, when interviewed, didn't suggest that they were in favor of him personally, but they were in favor of what he was standing for in terms of freedom. In contrast, the challenger conducted less than 20% of the events, and that includes the ones in the basement solo, and he garnered an average of, when there was a crowd, 0.03% of the crowd size. His 15 to the POTUS is 15,000. The POTUS had the largest of its kind supportive gathering. In a number of categories. There were more boats gathered together with a parade to support him, more bikers, more car caravans. Maybe you didn't know this, but more African-American marches in favor of a Republican candidate for POTUS in history. Golf carts even got together to support him. Even horse-drawn carriages in Amish country supported the POTUS in record numbers. The challenger, by contrast, had fewer events and had 5 to 20 people show up. There was a famous moment where the challenger came down these steps to a muted applause of 19 people that were standing in circles that were marked out 6 feet apart. The current POTUS promised freedom, patriotic, traditional civics education for our kids, and the third thing was really economic prosperity. The challenger promised higher taxes, more constraints, and some form of socialism. So then the November 3rd election came. And on the election night, things actually looked pretty good for POTUS. It might have been a reflection of the enthusiasm seen around the country leading up to the election in spite of the polls. If you take the New York Times data analytics predictor, Wisconsin and Georgia are very likely to be called for POTUS. At 11 p.m., the map looked like this right here. Do you see that? 271 electoral votes for POTUS. In fact, in there, Georgia's included. They had an 85% chance of winning based on the data analytics and the raw numbers that they were getting at the time. That's coming from New York Times. So there were only 61 electoral votes up for grabs at this time, at roughly 11 o'clock at night. Of the remaining states, Maine, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the POTUS was likely to win at least Pennsylvania and Michigan. Nevada and Arizona, too close to call. But at 11 o'clock, the odds were very good for the POTUS that he'd win Pennsylvania or Michigan and maybe Nevada and Arizona, in addition to the 271 that he already had, until something highly irregular occurred. Vote counting was stopped, and things changed overnight. Each large city in each of those battleground states seemed to hold all the levers of power for the whole country. There was alleged election fraud accounts. They came pouring in. Groups and individuals began investigating, gathering evidence, and they got affidavits as well. So the POTUS sued, his campaign sued Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, and he lost in pretty much all of those lawsuits. The courts basically, as a general rule, dismissed them on a technicality. Hey, you got here too late, you don't have standing, that type of thing. Others sued as well, though. At least one prominent lawyer sued without any pay. The state of Texas sued, and they made the argument this is a non-discretionary thing that the Supreme Court has to jump in. They're joined by 18 other states. They say, look, it's impossible mathematically to have that many votes overturned. I mean, there's a 1 in a trillion chance for one of those states, but for all 4 states to have it overturned in the same manner with big cities making the decision is a 1 in trillion to the 4th power chance. So please just give us a hearing. I knocked down the whole government again. That's what the Texas Supreme Court's saying. They're not asking you to rule. The Texas Supreme Court's saying, hey, we're not asking you, Supreme Court, to rule or for you to undo an election. We're just asking for a hearing. And if we're proven right, then you can kick it back to the legislatures and they can decide. Or you can require them to settle the issue in some other form. You can toss the illegal votes. But the Supreme Court didn't want to get involved at all. And so they punted by just saying you don't have standing. So you have a whole bunch of lawsuits, and in each one of these, there were a bunch of allegations made. This was a dishonest election is what they're basically saying. And a bunch of those allegations have made it out there, and you've probably heard some, and maybe so many that you don't know which are which. So what I'm going to do is just consolidate it to 5. 5 election allegations of misconduct that made it a dishonest election. Number 1 is that election law itself was not followed. That's pretty compelling, if true. The concept goes like this. Overreach on the part of the executive and the judicial branches in a number of states is not valid. In other words, governors were never supposed to set the stage for an election. That's not the Secretary of State's job to set up how the election law is handled. Courts are not supposed to allow for a change to law that's not ratified by the legislature. Only the legislature is supposed to set the legal parameters of the election. And that's, I guess, because they're closest to the people, but it was a brilliant thing that was put in the Constitution. The allegation of foul play is that since the Democrats did not control the state legislatures in these key battleground states, the Constitution was against them. They might not be able to win the presidency, so they planned in advance, way back in March, to get relief from their liberal courts. So let's just give you an example. In Pennsylvania, the executive branch, which was run by a Democrat governor and a Democrat Secretary of State, went to the liberal courts to change the Pennsylvania law for the election. The Pennsylvania court allowed them to eliminate signature requirements. Why would you want to do that? They allowed them to eliminate signature matching, eliminate the postal marking that would ensure some validity to that coming from the person that voted. And they extended the counting of the mail-in ballots to Friday, where the state's law says, no, it's got to be Tuesday at 8 o'clock. So this fundamentally changed Pennsylvania's election laws, nullified the federal constitution. Nullified the federal constitutional role of the Republican legislature in the state. It did both those things. And in addition to opening the door for all kinds of mischief, it created a lack of trust. That's Pennsylvania. In Georgia, the Secretary of State entered a compromise settlement agreement and release with the Democrat Party of Georgia. So in it, he made it much harder to challenge defective signatures. This is after Georgia's Democrat Party sued the Secretary of State in advance. So this is kind of crazy in a way because Georgia law already requires a process to confirm signatures. Those requirements were not imposed in this election. That's direct contradiction to Georgia's law. Georgia's Republican legislature had no role in these changes to the electoral results. So, what happened in these big battleground states? Major components of election laws were changed. And this happened in Wisconsin and Michigan as well. And in some instances, this was just done by fiat from the executive branch, in some cases with the help of the judicial branch, but neither of these are constitutional. But the state legislatures didn't change the election law in those states. And so the suits are saying, since that didn't happen, and since the executive branch can't unilaterally change election laws, and since the judicial branch can't ratify a law that wasn't changed by the legislature, and the U.S. Constitution provides protection here, just look at the U.S. Constitution, and in each of those cases, rule in favor of the Republicans, which would have ruled in favor of kicking out and tossing out all of those votes that didn't go for, that came in late. So the allegation of the violation of the Constitution was dismissed on technical grounds. The Supreme Court didn't want to take it up. The other courts didn't take it up or dismissed it without even looking at the evidence. So that was one. The other allegation is that there were illegal voters So, for example, in Georgia, there's 12,670 votes that separate the two candidates, but there's 40,279 folks who moved without re-registering, and that by itself is against the law, and those votes shouldn't be counted, enough to change the outcome. There's 66,247 that are underage. They aren't old enough to vote. This by itself should have been adjudicated. A fourth grader could have figured that one out. 15,700 voters who had filed a national change of address form without re-registering. 10,315 people who were dead voted in Georgia, and 305,701 people who, according to state records, applied for an absentee ballot, passed the deadline required by law. So that's the second allegation, that there was illegal voters voting, and that could have changed the outcome, especially in these slim win states like Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Number 3 is that there were just all kinds of irregularities observed. Witnesses testified that they saw thumb drives disappear. Testified that they saw boxes of ballots arrive through the back door. Allegations of adding ballots where almost all the votes went to the challenger. There's 2 ballot certifiers in Michigan's most populous county, and these guys were elected to their post. And in an affidavit, they said that 71% of the absentee ballots from Detroit were left unbalanced and unexplained. That's 7 out of 10. You've got to be kidding me. They're unexplained. You can't balance them out. And so 7 out of 10 in Detroit could have changed the outcome. So altogether, over 2,000 people have signed an affidavit stating that they observed irregularities. How many of those were interviewed by the main media? The fourth allegation is that data analytics by itself explains that it's impossible for the degree of change from 11 o'clock at one night, November 3rd, to the next morning for it to have changed as much as it did. So we could look at a number of things. There's more votes than voters or more ballots returning than going out. But let's just look at 2 things. First, let's just look at the New York Times predictor based on data analytics. And let's look at the 2 neighboring states, Florida and Georgia. So Florida has a Republican governor, Secretary of State, and legislature, all Republican. But they've got this huge Democrat population in Miami and Broward County. And that's just to the north of Miami, Broward County. So in the past, they would hold out and try to game the election in favor of the Democrat. This has happened many times. And the current governor, who barely won, decided he's going to change the system and make it really difficult to game the system in the future. So what he did is he said all the election results have to be turned in by 9 o'clock at night. And if they're not, you don't get to count them. And so if you can't turn them in by 9 o'clock, and you want them counted, you're going to have to stand before a judge to make it happen. So guess what? They turned them all in by 9 o'clock. And New York Times predicted the winner throughout the night. Look at this graph here of Florida. This is coming from the Edison data that New York Times and the Associated Press use, the actual time-stamped votes that come through like every minute. So Florida is predicted to win steady from 8 o'clock on. I mean, the POTUS has a greater than 80% chance of winning by 8 o'clock and near 100% from 9 o'clock on. No change. No allegations of voter fraud either. That's the predictor. In Georgia, neighboring state, similar situation. Republican governor, Secretary of State, and legislature. But they have this large Democrat place called Atlanta. They made all kinds of changes to the election system prior to the election, unlike Florida. They made it easier to game the system, unlike Florida. Now look at that Georgia chart. So you have it 83% prediction. The New York Times is predicting all the way till 11:30 at night that Georgia is going to go for the POTUS based on everything they know in their algorithm. It's going to go POTUS's way all the way till 11:30 at night, and then it flips, and then all the way through from then it's changed over to the other candidate. That's a difficult thing to swallow from my standpoint, because I just don't know how that can happen in one night when almost all the votes are in and those predictive analytics tools are so precise and those data scientists are so skilled. So another data analytics claim is just the number of votes that the POTUS held in key states at a certain time, and then those votes switching with large data dumps. It's a little different than that first claim in that it's just not normally considered possible for somebody to get close to 100% of the data dumps. So the challenger gets 96% of the data dumps from Michigan at 6:30 in the morning, which changed from the challenger being far behind to within striking distance and being able to actually pull ahead. So that's 4 of the 5. We'll look at the 5th here, and that's that the machines themselves can actually switch the vote. So there were allegations of vote switching from POTUS to the challenger by the voting machines themselves. I mean, this seems way out there. I couldn't believe it until I looked at the example. But here's the example. In Pennsylvania, you've got this Edison source data, and it's the actual data the AP uses and the New York Times uses, and it shows that some votes switched from POTUS to the challenger. So look at it this way. The source data can be retrieved from an election assets site, and you can get that off the New York Times or other sources. And it looks like this right here. Do you see that? That looks like a bunch of just words and names and all crammed together. That's the source data. Then if you look at the timestamp, it's kind of every minute the accumulation of that information. And so on November 3rd at 11:07 p.m. to 11:08 p.m., you find the POTUS loses votes, and they actually switch to the challenger. So in 1 minute, you get 54 more votes in Pennsylvania, total additional votes, okay, from 11:07 to 11:08. And that's added to the overall vote total. But the POTUS vote tally goes down by 18,000 votes, and the Biden vote tally goes up by 18,000 votes. That's out of 54 votes. Do you see that in the chart there? It's kind of crazy. So what's going on is votes are actually being shifted. So this data scientist said, look, man, I'm going to go through and look at each timestamp. I'm going to tally everything every minute from 11 o'clock all the way through. And the total for Pennsylvania all the way through the night was 220,883 votes that switched from POTUS to the challenger. And these are based on the timestamps that New York Times and the Edison data give you access to. So the vote win for the challenger was only 81,000 votes, but 220,000 of those votes seem to have switched from POTUS to the challenger, literally taken away from President of the United States to the challenger. So those are the 5 basic allegations. And, you know, they seem to be legitimate to some extent, at least a legitimate amount of evidence to warrant a hearing. I mean, I've been involved in litigation a number of times, and in each instance, I won because I was in the right. But you know, at the time, the court didn't know I was in the right because they have to evaluate the bad guy's claim, and then afterward, if in my case, in each instance, the bad guy had a bad claim and I won, but the court has to evaluate that. They don't know that up front. So in these instances, you have these plaintiffs from attorney generals to this nationally prominent attorney to the campaign's own attorneys, and they're all saying, look, we just want you, the court, to look at it and give us a chance to vet the data. But that didn't happen. So when you go back to the 3 branches of government and just look at that concept, it seems that the lower courts and the Supreme Court have abdicated their role, their responsibility. They didn't even mention the evidence in many of the cases they threw out. They certainly didn't look at them. Perhaps they didn't want to create riots in the street. I don't know. So now what happens? Well, when the judicial abdicates, what happens is the tripod becomes less balanced. And so it has almost no chance of national unity because you have given, by definition, one or two of the other branches more power than you should have. So in this case, more power to the judicial and to the executive than to the legislative. So if the court had the courage to rule as it should, it could put the losing voters at rest. If it heard the case, allowed the evidence, and as a matter of law ruled against POTUS, the people that voted for him would be more inclined to believe that the election was fair. But they dismissed the allegations without a legit calling of witnesses and vetting of the evidence. They abdicated on technical grounds without resolving it in a public court of law. In my opinion, they're guilty of promulgating a continuation of the belief that the election was dishonest. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But what should have happened is, rather than just dismiss the allegations, an honest and fair press should have interviewed the affiants. They should have done their own data analytics. They're great at graphs when it serves their purpose. What should have happened is that those on the challenger side should have supported a thorough review in public and with official hearings to put everyone at ease. As for the courts, they should have enforced the constitutionally explicit rules and not abdicated their critical role in balancing power. You know, when they abdicate, they open the door for tyranny, because you make one branch or another bigger than it's supposed to be compared to the others. And you can also create this administrative bureaucracy that's monstrous and maybe even worse. So now what? Well, it's now the job of Congress to honestly review the alleged election fraud. If members of the House and Senate ignore the allegations and the Supreme Court continues to punt during this historic time, how can we keep this great republic intact? That's what it's based on. So the outcome's uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen next Wednesday. Our system of government, though, needs to be realigned. It's still the greatest system in human history. So what's your role in helping America? Well, this is why I started the podcast. I think you can fix everything. It might take a while, but why don't you set up a 10-year plan to become an honest lawyer, an honest judge, an honest politician? I mean, in my mind, you're the hope of the country. Without you, I fear that we're going to be overrun by an unbalanced government. And Madison says when government is not balanced, ultimately it becomes tyranny. Thanks for listening. God bless you. We'll see you next time.
Hi, I'm David Farah. Thank you for listening to my dad's podcast, The Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. Click subscribe now to be sure you don't miss an episode. Share this podcast with your friends on social media and give The Barry Farah Show your 5-star rating. Check out today's show notes below this episode and at thebarryfarahshow.com. This podcast is also available in video format at The Barry Farah Show on YouTube. See you next time.